afternoon. I think the rain probably scared a lot of people. They don't know that they're missing good conversation, good food, but we will start on time. So I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to this conference today, and the conference is on business and human rights. And the exact title is from Frameworks to Profits, Examining the Interdependence of Business and Human Rights. So I'm Saroja Subramanian. I'm the director for the Elfenworks Center for Responsible Business here at St. Mary's College. And I'll take a few minutes to explain what our center is about and go from there, and also the structure of this conference. So the Elfenworks Center for Responsible Business here at St. Mary's, the mission is to promote research and education in the area of responsible business. No business starts out to be irresponsible. All businesses want to do good, but the idea for the center is to promote research and also innovative teaching and engagement with the community in terms of responsible business issues. And what we understand responsible business, or what we focus on, is issues related to how businesses impact the environment. So we know that it impacts, we are talking about the physical environment, and then social issues like inequality, poverty, and so on. And the third is governance issues, how it affects different stakeholders, including those who run the company, who are other stockholders, and other stakeholders. So these are typically called the ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. So what the center does is we offer research awards for faculty, showcase their research on our website. We wanted to show the website, but you can see it yourself. And also we have engagement sessions like this where we invite community partners. This is the 4th year we are having the conference. So we had conferences on business and inequality, business and healthcare, issues related to big data. And so at the end of last year, there was a big conversation on what is responsible business, how is that related to ethics and so on. So we decided to have a conference on that, human rights and business. The other reason to have this conference is this is the 10th anniversary of when the United Nations, they had this guiding principles on business and human rights. So in 2008 is when they drafted this, and it was approved by the Human Rights Council a few years later in 2011. But anyway, we thought it's a good time to reflect on how far businesses have come. Some businesses are merely into compliance, but do they go beyond? Are there examples of successes? What are some challenges? So those are some issues we'd like to discuss. We'd also like to discuss the ethical, philosophical framework, and the first panel will address that. So the structure of the conference is that we have 2 panels. Our first panel will start in a few minutes. And that panel will explore how human rights issues are framed in broader philosophical context, ethical, as well as in the Catholic theological framework. We are a Catholic college after all, so it makes sense. And the title of that is Language and Framework of Human Rights, Foundations in Ethics, Theology, and Philosophy. So the panel will be interactive. After the speakers speak, there will be opportunity for the audience to ask them questions. So the second panel, we'll have a short break after this panel, and the second panel will start at 3:15, and that panel will be on human rights implementation and compliance by businesses. So again, we will have panelists talk, and then we'll have a Q&A. We'll have a little bit longer break after that, and then at 5:30, we will have the keynote, From Wrongs to Rights, Why Securing Land Rights is Central to Businesses as a Human Rights Agenda. So those are the 3 sessions. After the last session, we will have a networking session, so I hope all of you will stay. There'll be good food, I promise you. And so we'll get started soon. And so I'd like to introduce my colleague and moderator for the first panel, who in turn will introduce the panelists. So Gregg Wolcott is a colleague here, a professor at St. Mary's. He teaches business ethics courses. And he has published extensively in a lot of peer-reviewed journals, in Journal of Business Ethics and similar journals, which are very reputable. He has a PhD in philosophy from Loyola University of Chicago. Yeah, I'm delighted, and he has been one of the architects who designed this conference. And Gregg will introduce and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Saroja. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today as your moderator for our first panel on the foundations of human rights. People get animated when discussing human rights. Rights claims as entitlements for some sort of treatment, as demands of non-interference by others in our affairs, as impositions of duties on others, or as aspirations for certain goods that will make for a flourishing society, are uttered frequently, pointedly, and with great conviction. But problems emerge, and I hope our first panel will begin to address them. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights serves as an enumeration of the entitlements that all individuals, regardless of their nation or birth of residence, are thought to possess in virtue of being persons. But what is it about being a person that gives rise to something like a right? Why think we are better served recognizing rights than not? And despite the passion by which rights claims are made, people simply do not use the term human rights in ways that are always compatible. Furthermore, even if we could settle on a definition of the term, can we agree on which rights matter and when? If we scratch beneath the surface and examine the Declaration's many articles, it's not clear how in practice the listed human rights hang together coherently or easily. Businesses and governments confront this issue daily, as we see in the headlines of the news. A right to act on one's conscience or to express one's religious beliefs, especially through one's work, may appear to conflict with others' claims to be free from discrimination or to secure goods and services. A right to earn a living and pursue new ideas or technologies can conflict with cultural and environmental rights because of disruptions to traditions, communities, and nature. Some view rights to cultural and national identity as threatened by others' rights to seek opportunities for safety and prosperity in new lands. A right to compete or work for work or patronage can threaten others' rights to a secure livelihood or particular working conditions. Some feel the right to privacy conflicts with rights to safety and security. The list is endless. But these conflicts illuminate the need for a framework by which to order, clarify, and prioritize rights claims. But what tools do we have to do that? There's another practical danger. When rights claims are on the table for being qualified or revised, it seems more difficult to expect businesses and governments to be dedicated to human rights. In the face of moral disagreement and constantly changing valuations of rights in a pluralistic world, no one is ever satisfied. Why then should anyone care? Another challenge. History shows us that governments often enact unjust laws and create morally evil rights for some persons at the expense of others. Businesses, if they do not take the lead to act responsibly, may in fact acquiesce and support injustices. Thus we ask, how much should we rely on laws to guide practice? At the very least, business persons would seem to need a firm ethical foundation by which to judge between what the law permits and what is in fact morally right. Now, these questions have been raised since time immemorial, and we do not pretend to answer all of them now. But it does behoove us to try to gain some clarity about what we mean when we talk about rights before we can get into the practical problems and opportunities presented by human rights for responsible business activity in our subsequent sessions. Therefore, our first panel begins today's conversation by establishing some of the foundations and language of human rights, especially within the tradition of liberal arts and the Catholic Lassallean identity of St. Mary's College. Our panelists will explore how it is that the relatively new concept of human rights is rooted in a long philosophical and theological tradition, how specifically Catholic social teaching treats and applies human rights to contemporary business and social concerns, and then how ministerial and practical experience animate and sustain a commitment to the promotion of human rights in business. We do not expect everyone to accept a broadly Catholic or even religious worldview, but we instead seek to mine the value that our college's rich heritage can offer to the broader society's conversation about what will in fact promote the common good. Our panelists, who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to these matters, will each speak for a short amount of time, and at the end we'll open the floor to discussion, as Saroja has mentioned, where we invite you all to ask questions of any of them. But I begin by introducing our first panelist. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Buckley, Senior Lecturer of Philosophy at Santa Clara University. Among a few other graduate degrees, Dr. Buckley also holds a PhD in philosophy from Loyola University Chicago and a JD from the George Washington University. Formerly a practicing attorney, he is now a scholar in many fields of philosophy. He'd be embarrassed for me to say this, but he teaches just about everything at Santa Clara, including philosophy of law, medical ethics, business ethics, the history of philosophy, political philosophy, and ethical theory, among others. And we're delighted that he has joined us today, and he's braved the Bay Area traffic from down the peninsula to join our panel. So please welcome Dr. Buckley.
Thanks, Greg. Greg and I went to grad school together, and somehow we're still friends, so I guess that's a good thing. Good afternoon. So what I wanted to talk to you about was Catholic philosophy, rights, and the dignity of the human person. The place of rights within political and legal discourse today seems secure. No one questions whether or not addressing rights in a court and proposed legislation or in actions of a government is appropriate. But although frequently used, the word rights is a word rarely defined or otherwise articulated. What I would like to do here is to provide a little context to the discussion of rights today, because I think that the concept is a bit foundationless. In business and elsewhere, there may be questions about infringing on rights, invoking rights, protecting rights, or expanding rights. What there is little discussion of, however, is the basis of rights. Are they merely a social construction? Do we have the rights we determine we have? And do we cease to have such rights when the majority of government determine this to be the case? If that seems wrong to you, then what can determine which rights seem plausible and which do not? Which seem permanent and which do not? Which appear non-negotiable and which do not? I propose that one way to answer these questions and provide a powerful articulation of the grounding of rights is to consider Catholic philosophy with its beginnings in Greek thought and centered on a philosophical understanding of human nature. Understanding the connection between human rights and Catholic philosophy requires first that we become familiar with the Church's perspective on the human person. This is because rights should properly be understood as linked to the human person, to human needs and human nature. The Church teaches that, quote, a just society can become a reality only when it is based on the respect of the transcendent dignity of the human person. The person represents the ultimate end of society by which it is ordered to the person. Hence, the social order and its development must invariably work to the benefit of the human person, since the order of things is to be subordinate to the order of persons and not the other way around, end quote. To be clear, this position assumes that it would never be possible to know what what rights humans have if it is not first clear who the human animal is or what he or she requires for natural fulfillment. Without this philosophical anthropology, any rights obtained in law may be viewed as mere policy preferences passing a test of political prudence for now. To best describe this Catholic philosophy of the human person, it is worth considering ancient Greek thought on this topic. This is a philosophical anthropology explored over 2,400 years ago that assumes that any worthwhile politics, ethics, or law must be based primarily on what it is to be human. For example, in his Politics, Aristotle noted that the human is by nature a social animal. Unlike certain mammals, such as bears who live solitary lives, the life of the human is a social existence, similar to ants or to bees. Our completion apart from society is impossible. It is society that gives us our language, our education, our religion, and which fosters meaningful relationships in our lives. Our social institutions, our laws, our games and entertainment all act as civilizing elements completing the human. This is why Aristotle said that the human is made for a communal existence and cannot be complete apart from it. And good government is that which understands its charge as providing the structures, economics, and laws that promote a cohesive community of complete individuals. Furthermore, this communal existence is complemented by a life of contemplation and the exploration of ideas. Both Aristotle and Plato held that philosophy begins in wonder. The human is drawn toward the truth, reaching out to know it for its own sake. When the truth encompasses political, legal, and ethical components, it requires humans to know their place in society and to look deep within themselves. Plato has Socrates defend his philosophizing by saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. Why? Not simply because it is fun or interesting, but because a human who does not use reason to contemplate the moral life and excellence is a human not fully embracing the gifts given to him or to her by nature. It is akin to an elephant not using its trunk, or a giraffe ignoring what its neck can do. For the Greeks, the other animals are not capable of reasoning, but the human is. So human happiness and fulfillment must be tied to proper and excellent use of this reason in self-examination, contemplation of law, and exploration of political options for human thriving. Complementing this philosophical anthropology is a Catholic tradition explicitly embracing Greek thought. Having its roots in the use of Greek in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, observed in the fact that the New Testament was all written in Greek, the Church's early existence was a Greek-inspired one. Strangely enough, even Paul's letter to the Romans was written in Greek, not in Latin. In fact, an overwhelming number of the writings of the early church fathers are in Greek. Pope Benedict said it was this combination of early Christianity with Greek thought that allowed for faith to express itself meaningfully. This heritage of Greek thought is carried forward into Christianity explicitly in a Platonic vein by St. Augustine and a Neoplatonic and Aristotelian vein fashioned by St. Thomas Aquinas. Often this division is made too distinct, in my opinion, but there are certain differences in emphasis. For clarity's sake, I will only address the embracing of Neoplatonic and Aristotelian Greek thought by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. In his endeavor to do what many said at the time was not possible, Aquinas looked to the work of Aristotle in particular to express how to live out a Christian existence while understanding and practicing a Christian Catholic faith. The entire Summa Theologica, Thomas's largest work, is written in a Neoplatonic assumption that the human is a product of God's love and God's goodness, and while mortal existence can be a happy and beautiful one, that life is in preparation of a return to God, who is the complete and eternal good for which all humans are made. For Thomas, the starting point is human nature, and divine revelation through Christ completes that nature, it doesn't destroy it. How this becomes articulated in ethics, politics, and law is through Aquinas' reliance on Greek understandings of human nature drawn principally from Aristotle. Thomas notes that the human person is capable of developing the habit of justice and perfecting the will toward others in a community properly formed and directed by law. In his practical philosophy, there is a complex, nested series of assumptions, yet all are reliant on some form of Greek thought. The human person is drawn toward the good. But what good? The answer is happiness. But what is happiness? Happiness is the life where a human is capable of developing his or her talents within a stable community that perfects them by promoting within him or her necessary virtues that allow for meaningful relationships. There is a potential in the human person that can only be developed when living together and living together well. So, justice, politics, law, and a virtue-based ethics all come together in an intricate and layered understanding of the human community. The just person lives her life developing the habit of directing her excellence towards others and promoting the good of the community. In doing that, she is complemented by a law that facilitates this life by creating mechanisms and institutions that guide her, provoke her, educate her toward her own excellence. But her own excellence is reliant upon transcending her own interests to work towards the good of others. In doing this, her life is coupled with the goal of the law, which is to promote the common good. This common good is that communal existence where the human needs of those in the community are met. In these cases, justice is done when persons in the community get what is due to them, both in transactions and as members of the community through distribution of scarce goods. Justice demands reciprocity in contracts between parties and equality before the law. And the aim of justice is that individuals receive their due as members situated in a community existing in part to help them thrive. Thomas pulls together the human person's individual needs and ability to thrive through virtues with a law that promotes those virtues in its legislation, various procedures, and institutions, and then provides the necessary goods for the members of the community to cultivate excellence. In this way, the law is understood as inextricably tied to the will of the people and the good of the people. These human or positive laws derive their substance and procedure in conformity with natural law. And natural law is the discoverable moral law that acts as a check or boundary on which is proper human law. Again, drawing its roots from the same Greek reliance on human nature, natural law is understood from the combination of two major components of the human animal, the capacity to reason and human biology. The two are brought together when reason is used to reflect on itself and on the biological half of human nature. In this way, someone like Martin Luther King could use natural law in his letter from Birmingham jail as a way to determine the clear injustice of segregation. Relying on the famous Augustinian phrase that law which is not just is not law, King then explicitly invokes Thomas Aquinas' understanding that the secular law must align with the moral law and the law of God. In analyzing segregation, King gives explicit accounts of how it violates natural law. They address both when it is procedurally unjust, for example, the fact that the law does not derive from but is nevertheless applied to those who could not vote on it, and when it is substantively unjust, for example, denying people the ability to eat or stay the night in certain places. To be clear, King can rely on Aquinas and this tradition because this tradition gives him the tools and ability to see segregation as wrong because it inhibits the growth, maturation, and authenticity of the human person. So to summarize, the Catholic tradition regarding ethics, politics, and law, as shown in the work of Thomas Aquinas, relies upon a strong understanding of the philosophy of the human person begun with the Greeks. What is required for people to thrive is justice, law, and political institutions that promote the full development of virtuous citizens living lives directed toward and also influenced by the common good. And that common good is achieved when the people are fully developed because they receive the education, sustenance, and attention they need to become complete within a safe and developed community. As Aristotle noted, the human is a social animal, and that social aspect is best fulfilled with justice, a virtue ethics, and a positive law always in conformity with a moral law discovered by reasoning about human nature. As noted, this is an intricate and nested series of elements that form a complicated web, but also provide a powerful guide for any future political development. As was seen with Martin Luther King, this tradition may continue to provide a rich basis for analysis of institutions and considerations of rights today. Explicitly concerning modern rights, the Church states that, quote, "The ultimate source of human rights is not found in the mere will of human beings, in the reality of the state, or in public powers, but in man himself and in God as creator. These rights are universal, inviolable, inalienable. Universal because they are present in all human beings without exception of time, place, or subject. Inviolable insofar as they are inherent in the human person and in human dignity. Inalienable insofar as no one can legitimately deprive another person, whoever they may be, of these rights, since this would do violence to their nature," end quote. An example may suffice in this regard. Consider the right to property. This is obviously an essential element of business, whether it be real property, personal property, or intellectual property. Imagine a person, Jack, who wants to possess an acre of land and develop it, but he is told that such a purchase is not possible because all the land is owned by the government or by the local warlord. We might question philosophically, what is Jack deprived of? Clearly he's deprived of the right to property, but what does that mean in this case? How is that to be explained? Leaning on the discussion we've had up to this point, we might ask whether or not reason, reflecting on human biology, would argue that humans need real property in order to become complete. Could Jack be an essential part of a vibrant community where each person is allowed to develop into a complete individual guided by law when he does not have the right to own property? With property rights, it seems reasonable to assume that Jack would have more safety and more easily engage in relationships with others because his property is secure, because he has a space he can carve out from the world. Further, he might choose more easily to get married and have children when he has a place to grow a family. In addition, as a landowner, Jack would likely immediately be more involved with local and political issues because he now has more at stake. Certainly, the lack of such right to property would affect Jack's desire to develop any land or enrich any land or otherwise invest any time in any land. According to the government at under that scenario, his labor would have no value at this time. The government, local warlord, neighbors, or roaming hordes could come and take the product of all his hard work. All of his time and effort would be for naught. If that were the case, because there was no right to property, Jack would choose not to develop businesses either. He would not begin a business, invest in a business, engage in risk-taking, or otherwise be creative. Whatever products would naturally come about through his work on the land or in business would not, therefore, redound to the community. And whatever suppliers he would have bought from would lose that business. And whatever employees he might have hired would never get that opportunity. And whatever customers that would have enjoyed his products are left without. We might reasonably say that the community is less when Jack is less. And when Jack is less, the community is less. And what other effects toward the overall development of the community would occur from not recognizing that right to property? Could anyone reasonably claim that such a community would be better developed, safer, cleaner, and more stable without the right to property? Wouldn't there be less amount of money coming in from taxes to devote towards education, towards child development programs, towards health initiatives, toward programs to alleviate poverty? If the human person needs certain basic things in order to thrive in the 21st century, and those things are more easily determined to be possible with the right to property being recognized in law, then wouldn't the absence of such a right have a profound effect on health, safety, welfare, and the morals of the community? Wouldn't the common good diminish because the citizens would not develop their potential as rational animals? Moving beyond land, it seems reasonable to look at the right to own intellectual property. In this case, imagine Maria as a computer programmer working intensely on the development of algorithms. Maria is among the best in her field. Owning her own business, she knows that whatever breakthroughs she creates will be patentable and recognizable in law as her property for a fixed number of years. This is what causes Maria to get up early and work late. She gives up many opportunities as she works diligently to secure something new and innovative. The right to property with the concomitant profit and recognition impels her to work this hard. Maria, however, would not work this hard if there were not a recognized right to this property. And it would do violence to her as a person if someone were to take away the product of her labor. Philosophically, it might be argued that stealing Maria's work means doing violence to Maria herself. That property stolen is inseparable from her. Taking it means hurting her. And what would happen if others see the way Maria is treated? After that, why would anyone work hard to develop a vaccine or create some new algorithm or write a new book or song if they knew that the government could either take that property from them or fail to protect such property through law? The community loses the innovations, the products of these labors. It may be that some algorithm that Maria works on provides a significant leap in computer capabilities and that then affects biomedical mapping or genetic testing. But if Maria never made that breakthrough, then such gains to the community never occur. It seems then that there's an inextricable link between the right to property and human dignity. John Locke argues that the human person owns herself, so therefore she owns that which she mixes her labor with. Notice then that the starting point is the essential freedom of the human person. This is the foundation of property. Denying the property right then seems to deny the fact that the person owns herself. There is certainly an intimacy between humans and the ability to own property. In Letter from Birmingham Jail, King links segregation with destitution, stating that the black Americans suffer while smothered in a, quote, airtight cage of poverty, end quote. This is due in part to the limited right of blacks to own property by housing ordinances and other restrictive covenants that constituted part of a larger web of denying capital to black citizens through redlining and other means. Depriving people of the right to property based upon arbitrary factors like race invokes the justice that Aquinas addressed as ensuring through law that people get what is due to them. The Catholic Church notes in this regard that, quote, by means of work and making use of the gift of intelligence, people are able to exercise dominion over the earth and make it a fitting home. In this way, he makes part of the earth his own, precisely the part which he has acquired through work. This is the origin of individual property. Private property and other forms of private ownership of goods assure a person a highly necessary sphere for the exercise of his personal and family autonomy and ought to be considered as an extension of human freedom. Stimulating exercise of responsibility, it constitutes one of the conditions for civil liberty. Private property is an essential element of an authentically social and democratic economic policy, and it is the guarantee of a correct social order, end quote. Catholic teaching about rights may then be understood as clearly relying upon a rich and complex tradition of law, politics, and ethics centered on the human person and natural law. To argue that rights are what is owed to persons would be to argue that rights complete persons. This connection could offer a powerful mode of criticism against things like segregation because of how it affects the ability of humans with dignity to thrive in the community through personal development in tandem with economic development. Denying African Americans explicitly or implicitly their right to property is to prevent them from being complete as humans and thus taking their place within a community properly oriented towards the common good. As King could use Aquinas to criticize segregation, so too today can the tradition of Catholic philosophical anthropology continue to inform discussions about the right to unionize, the rule of law, the right to be secure, equality, and the overall economic development around the world. In this way, making sure that individuals receive what is due to them, we move beyond individualism by elevating individual needs as essential for vibrant members of an overall common good in which we may all take our place. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Our next panelist is one of St. Mary's own, Dr. Suka Hara. Dr. Suka Hara is also a polymath. He's not only a faculty member at St. Mary's, where he's a professor of economics and a tutor in the Integral program, but he's also the chair of our own John F. Henning Institute and alum of St. Mary's College from his undergraduate years. He holds a doctorate in economics from Claremont Graduate University and has worked extensively in the banking, finance, and corporate industries. We're so fortunate that he is joining our panel and I believe taking time from his sabbatical to be here with us today. So please welcome Dr. Suka Hara.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate the introduction. And Saroja, I really do appreciate the excuse to do something productive in the sabbatical. Otherwise, I'd find myself on my way to Las Vegas to watch basketball. So this comes at a high price for pleasure. First of all, I want to start off with a disclaimer. It should be obvious from this introduction that I'm neither a trained theologian nor a philosopher. As it was made clear, I retired from my corporate career about a quarter of a century ago, and I abandoned my faculty role in management education more than a decade ago. They're all answers to why I made these choices. My kids would say it's because I can't hold a job, and they've always been critical about why we've had to move from place to place as I went from job to job. Greg had asked me if I would share some things about some of my jobs, and I've reflected on it deeply, and I've realized that I can't give away some of the ethical issues that I've encountered in business because the people who were unethical are still alive, and I do wonder if I'm going to have a clawback on their error or to me if I say all of this. So let me just launch into what I'm supposed to do. I should declare straight up that I'm a reasonably observant Catholic, and I still claim to be a lapsed economist. I'm lapsed because I do read it, but I don't necessarily believe it. So I'm going to offer my contributions today from the perspective of a lay person, and that's how I want you to treat it. I'm not an academic in these remarks. I'm just a lay person. And my job as a lay person has been to try to understand the church and how the church reacts to the world we live in today. Bryan has been very useful in his comments to set up this particular talk, particularly with establishing the notion of the human person, which is central to the understanding of what Catholic social teaching is about. So that philosophical base, I think, is very helpful for you to come from. In the course of our discussion, I think it may come out that this is not the only perspective that arises in the world, and it may be that there'll be some dispute that the church is in the old times because we follow the old philosophy, and that comes out to an old religion, and the world is different, and we should be looking for a new philosophy and a new religion to help explain how to cope with things. I don't think that's inconsistent. I think the church survives this, and in the process of the afternoon, maybe it'll become clearer why I'm making that particular claim. But right now, what it is my job is to try to make the bridge to the human rights discussion via the church. So I think there are three questions I have to answer today. One, what is Catholic social teaching? Or I'm going to call it CST for short. And then, how does CST relate to human rights? And then finally, I'm going to try to provide an answer to the question, why should people involved in business really care about what's happening in this set of remarks and what the church has to say about these particular things? In preparing my remarks for you today, I've made the assumption that most of you are not Catholic, and so the language, the vocabulary may become part of the challenge that we have. For those of you who are Catholic, I've assumed that your education about being Catholic was similar to mine, and that is it probably stopped formally when you went through the preparation for confirmation, and if you were lucky enough to attend a Catholic college for your education, it might have been related to those courses you were required to take in theology as part of your degree studies. That's clearly the case with me. So where do we get our information about what the church thinks about particular things? The common place is the homily or the sermon, which is gospel-inspired if it's properly constructed by the priest or the minister. But I think those of you who are regular attendees of any formal church will recognize that preaching is a lost art, and that often the gospel does not inspire the particular homily. So it's pretty hard to tell whether or not the position being expressed in this has any relation to the theology of the church in play. What I've come to over my years of attending formal services is to be fairly skeptical when I listen to the homily, because I've discovered that theology and politics are strange bedfellows. So I think my job right away is to try to establish what is the social teaching of the church and where do we find it if we want to study it further. Bryan mentioned in a couple of the statements he had about where the church's social positions are. This comes from a document called the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which was created by an organization that comes out of Vatican II. It's the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. And this is a very useful volume to get if you're interested in learning more about the church's position on social issues. It's really laid out like a textbook. I've got a copy of it in my office, and it forced me when Saroja asked me to make these remarks to go back and read it again to just see if I can get some ideas. What this volume contains are the messages that are in the official publications of the Vatican. It comes out in speeches, homilies, encyclicals, and other documents. The regional conferences of bishops also have documents that are contained in there, but it's organized by topics, so it's easy enough that if you've got a particular topic you're interested in to go through and find out the various sources. What's interesting to see when you look at this is that there is a chain of ideas that connect historically, and a little later on in the talk I'll give you an idea of what that chain is, so that what Bryan has set up earlier with this fundamental principle about the human, it is there. It may not be as clearly stated in each of the documents in the old form as it is in the new form. So this is part of the language we're going to go to. So let me do the trickiest part first. What do we take in reading these documents when we see the term Catholic? And I've decided that it makes sense for me to look at it how it's derived. And the person who helps me get to this view is a Catholic philosopher, Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor laid out in a lecture he gave about 20 years ago that when he sees the term Catholic, he translates it as universality through wholeness. And so it has some elements in that sort of definition that ties into what Bryan said earlier about the way we look at the human person through the eyes of the Catholic Church. All right, so now what we then have to do is say, what are these particular things? Catholic social teaching is best summarized, if you're looking for a quick and dirty read, in the little volume called the Catechism of the Catholic Church. There is an abridged version of it, which is a lot slimmer than the fat version of it. I've got the slim version, and that's where I went. In there, the Catholic social teaching resides on 4 principles. One is what Bryan laid out very clearly for us, called the dignity of the human person. That is the key principle. Beyond that are principles called subsidiarity, common good, and solidarity. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Those terms themselves, when they're laid out, if you haven't seen the way the words have been framed, it's not often understood appropriately. Common good becomes one of the tricky ones in this particular mix. So as we have, Bryan has laid out the philosophy behind the dignity of the human person, and I think that's a very useful thing if your memory still works well enough to what he said 10 minutes ago. So what we want to do is just quote a few things here. He basically is saying the ultimate goal of human activity is eternal happiness, which is only satisfied by God. So in the Catholic view here, there's a role for God. In other views, God gets lost. And I think that's one of the things that when you start looking at modern debates is there a role for God in the conversation? The church will always argue God has to be present in the conversation, or the conversation is not Catholic in its sense. Catholic universality through wholeness. All right? This promised happiness confronts us with decisive moral choices concerning earthly goods and urges us to love God above all things. This is coming straight out of the Catechism. What's important for me when I read that part of the Catechism is something that we're all really interested in, because that's why the study of management or business or economics is important. It's about making choices and to understand what it is that drives us in making choices. And if we don't think about that much, then we're not really very human. Okay? The next piece that we need to do is bring in a little bit more theology. Catholic social teaching draws upon the inherent communion in the Trinity to identify that particular thing that Bryan talked about earlier, that notion of love. Love of what? Love of the neighbor. Love of neighbor is inseparable from the love of God, straight out of the Catechism. What this advances is the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity guides our relationship between the person and society. What this does in many ways is it puts in real context and real constraint the role of the state. This is basically an argument that the state should not be involved if it could be done by an organization that is lower than the state, back to the family, perhaps. And so in some ways, it is an argument against this tendency that the state will solve all our problems. We can walk away from our responsibilities to those particular problems. All right, what drives this is another piece of theology. And in there is a theological virtue which is called charity. Most of us, if those of you went through sort of parochial school like I did, there was faith, hope, and charity. All right. Charity gets sort of misunderstood in those terms because it's not the word that I think is being implied. The term that's implied is really love, and that's what we have to keep in mind. It's love that becomes fairly complex because it's a love of God for man, which then has to be emulated by man towards man. Back to Bryan's point about human person, dignity, how do we frame that particular part? So why is this important? We can't discover the common good without having some sense of love in our soul. And so that's another part of what's there. And then this comes down to this notion of human fulfillment that was mentioned in the first talk. That philosophical principle is buried clearly in this particular argument for a common good. And it competes now with a modern view that some people have of trying to fulfill human potential. For those of you who have been raised in sort of the modern philosophy, and this is Amartya Sen's view of the human potential, it is not the same thing as human fulfillment. So it becomes very complex if you started to get into a conversation with somebody, is to make sure that you have the basis of what is the argument that you're trying to bring forward. But again, there is a little piece that comes down through this that we sort of ignore. We've had a lot of conversation about rights. There's a quote out of the Catechism that I want to read to you, and it deals with the common good. All men and women are expected to take personal responsibility to achieve the common good through their actions to participate in public life as far as possible. So there is an action that you have to do. You have to be involved in this if it's going to be accomplished. So the rights discussion often never surfaces the responsibility question. I say this now, and it's a sort of a footnote to what I saw about a half an hour ago before I came over to the room. There was a survey taken about the best and worst states to live in the United States. And the very worst state in this poll came out to be California. And it was for a variety of reasons. Some of it was the lack of true environmentally sound and healthy options for citizens. Some of us would say it's the cost of living. But one of the factors that came out of it was voter participation. The low rate of participation in public activity in the state of California was one of the driving factors in this poll that was taken and just published. So it was startling to me because I thought Californians were very participatory in the political process. So their people are doing it better than us. Right, so that's basically what that comes down to, and it all leads to there's this notion of solidarity. Solidarity is sort of working together. It gets translated in more modern Catholic documents as a spirit of fraternity, and it's something that we can trace to Pope Benedict, and I'll say something about this in a few minutes. So when you come down to key documents, if you really want to go through and do a quick study of Catholic social teaching, you don't have to read all of the things. There's some things you should start with. One is Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum, published about 120 years ago by Pope Leo XIII, is the foundational document. If you get the text, and you can find it online, it's free. You can go to the Vatican Library and download almost anything for free. If you read this, the vocabulary that I gave you earlier from the Catechism doesn't reside there. The ideas are there. And what's interesting is if you see that set of ideas and you read the modern documents, and the one that some of you are probably more familiar with than Rerum Novarum is Pope Francis' Laudato Si, you can see exactly the same themes. It just in a slightly more elevated set of language than what Leo XIII wrote about. But what's more interesting is why this document was put together. Rerum Novarum is a statement subtitled Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor. And it was a document that's put together almost as a case against socialism. And in doing so, by contrast, what emerges is the options for the world, which would be what we had in the West, which would be more democratic options, had a stronger appeal, but within that, it only works if we were conscious of our both rights and duties as either owners of capital or owners of labor. So one of the things I've discovered over time is people will use Rerum Novarum almost like code, that this has to be right because it's there, and this is the right to organize, to form unions. I often wonder if they've read the whole document, because there are other things that are interesting in there as well. For those who would argue that we read Rerum Novarum because it supports the right to private property, I will say go back and read it. It's a responsible right to private property, not an absolute right to private property. So that's one document. Fast forward, Vatican II happens. Vatican II happens, and as a result, there's another important encyclical to take a look at, and this is by Pope Paul VI. It's called Populorum Progressio. What this particular encyclical does is it puts Rerum Novarum into the modern world, or what I would call the post-World War II world. It takes what was originally looked at, in my view, as a document written for people within a state to looking at the responsibility of states as partners in the world and how this fits together. So it is, in my view, one of the first statements of globalization that's there that often is ignored. His arguments in that particular encyclical resonate today. And why do we worry about it? Because the fundamental end of all of this is world peace, and that we can't express ourselves in full fulfillment in a world not peaceful. So that's where this comes forward. And of course, the timing of this is really interesting because it comes also at the heels of when the Declaration of Human Rights was passed by the United Nations. And in there's a strong element of Catholic influence in those documents. And what we need to do is to take a look at, again, it was aimed at the fulfillment of all peoples, not particular peoples. So there is that Catholic thing that goes on. But key to all of this is that there is an idea that comes out that you will read again. It's called integral human development. This is where language gets tricky. It took me months to figure out what the modifier integral really meant. And so going back and reading Pope Paul, it said, I'm going to quote him here, "In God's plan, every man is born to seek self-fulfillment, for every human life is called to some task by God." I read that and I said, well, that sounds like vocation. We all have a vocation. We're all looking for self-fulfillment. And that doesn't mean that just because you might say my vocation is to be a priest, your vocation could be to be an accountant. You're looking for self-fulfillment. And so, in a way, there's something there, all right? But remember, God in this statement is in the forefront. Just as the whole of creation is ordered toward its creator, so the rational creature should, of his own accord, direct his life to God, the first truth and the highest good. Back to the philosophy introduction, there again, the philosophical roots behind the argument is there. Human self-fulfillment may sum up all our obligations. So this is where integral human development is. Why raise this at this point? Again, those of you whose introduction to Catholic social teaching is through Laudato Si, that's clearly Pope Francis's message again, and it's 50 years later. All right, so the Pope cautions us, this is Pope Paul VI, to keep values and perspectives as we seek fulfillment. Quote, "The pursuit of life's necessities is quite legitimate. Hence, we are duty-bound to do the work which enable us to obtain them. But the acquisition of worldly goods can lead men to greed, to the unrelenting desire for more, to the pursuit of greater personal power. The exclusive pursuit of material possessions prevents man's growth as a human being and stands in opposition to his true grandeur. Avarice in humans and in nations is the most obvious form of stultified moral development. Integral human development then represents the freely chosen actions of man, describing his, quote, transition from less human conditions to truly human ones." So the whole message in Catholic social teaching is really about what was developed. It's developing virtue, developing character, developing a sense of being more human. It's described in some other writings as a new humanism. And as reflecting on it, I started to think that this whole notion of virtue and character is not just simply a message that comes out of the ancient Greeks. You'll find that same message coming out from another side of the world. I can read this in Confucius, at least in my reading of Confucius, and I think I'm now trying to understand why Confucius has sort of become the main politically accepted doctrine in China, whether it is just a march to tradition or have they woken up to the fact that there is something about virtue and character that they've discovered. All right, so let's just fast forward to a couple more documents that you might want to read. There is a great encyclical by Pope Benedict who many of you would probably not read because you think Pope Benedict is too conservative in his theology. But I think this encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, which was written as sort of a tribute to Populorum Progressio, is wonderful because it identifies clearly what is the theological foundation to integral human development. And he says, charity is at the heart of the Church's social doctrine. Love is God's greatest gift to humanity. It is his promise and our hope. All right? This becomes even more evident as he goes to the following statement. Charity goes beyond justice because to love is to give, to offer what is mine to the other, but it never lacks justice, which prompts us to give the other what is his, what is due him by reason of his being or his acting. If we love others with charity, then we are, first of all, we are just towards them. So what this does for me is it frames the sort of modern discussion about justice issues and gives you a foundation. Why should we do this? And why can't it be lasting? Well, I think if we trust man's desires to love as simply man as an end, then I think we might want to reflect on what Pope Francis said when he was chosen, that he was making a statement that we should all sort of remember. Pope Francis, if you remember when they pulled the curtain back and said, this is our new Pope, almost his first words was that, you have to remember, I am a sinner. Basically, it was his argument that as man, he recognized that we're all flawed in some ways, and our obligation as man is to become more human, to work past our flaws. So the behavioral assumptions is basically back to the ancients. The ancients are making an argument that we're looking to become better. There's no argument that this process is ever finished. I don't think we have in either of the icons that we read in the classical philosophical documents anyone we can say would make the claim that they are the perfect person. We don't see that in the Eastern literature, and we don't see it in the Western literature. So this is something that modern man seems to forget, that we have come very close to the idea that we can create perfection. And God forbid we think we can program that, because I think one of the real drives behind modern technology is to create the best form of man through machine. All right, so Benedict is someone I think you should read, and of course, you should read Pope Francis. Now, why the contrast between the two? Pope Benedict gives you, I think, the real new theological foundations behind this. He comes up with a notion of gift, gratuitousness, which I think becomes a new principle that will be recognized in Catholic social teaching. But when you look at Laudato Si, Pope Francis, he's the pastor. When you read him, he's the voice that sort of suggests that's the homily that we should be hearing on Sundays, because he makes that connection between the gospel message and the message for you to think about your actions. So let me read a line from this. And this is one that I think some of you may recognize. If the present ecological crisis is one small sign of the ethical, cultural, and spiritual crisis of modernity, we cannot presume to heal our relationship with nature and with the environment without healing all our fundamental human relationships. Christian thought sees human beings as possessing a particular dignity above all creatures. It thus inculcates esteem for each person and respect for others. Our openness to others, each of whom is a thou, capable of knowing, loving, and entering into dialogue, remains the source of our nobility as human persons. So what this is saying is that the whole notion behind the Catholic social teaching is an orientation that is trying to take you from what I think you get in what we would call the Enlightenment philosophical view about the inward look at the individual to a healthier look is looking out to the other, and through that reflection being able to see the shared humanity that we all have. All right, so where do we find this best expressed? I don't think I want to read it all to you, but there is a very good summary of the Church's current commitment to human rights contained in an address that Pope Francis gave at the beginning of this year at the traditional welcome for the diplomats who serve the Vatican. In there, he specifically talks about the Catholic social teaching as it relates to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he did make some caution. He said, the social upheaval since the 1960s has not only altered the interpretation of these rights, but also advanced the inclusion of a number of new rights that are not infrequently in conflict with others. This ever-expanding list of rights produces a real possibility of loss of focus of human fundamental rights outlined in the Declaration, the right of every human person to life, liberty, and personal security. And he goes on to say we ought to affirm these rights for individuals to get medical care and necessary social services. So what he's arguing is that the rights discussion as it's proceeded has, in a sense, moved past the fundamental agreement that was created in the document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it has not gone to take a look deeply enough as to the possibilities that they've overstepped their claim. All right. His argument is clearly one for us to keep in mind. But then let's go back and just go back to sort of the right to work, because I think this is the one that I think is important because it ties back to Rerum Novarum. He suggests the importance of the right to employment. All right. He says following, there can be no peace or development if individuals are not given the chance to contribute personally by their own labor to the growth of the common good. He questions the increasing use of ever more perfect and precise technologies and tools that can replace human beings. This new industrial world would result in a just an inequitable distribution of work opportunities. Perhaps this is a result of how we've sort of lost the progress on the right to education, and a tendency to demand laborers to an even more progressing workplace. In other words, the pursuit of profit dictated by globalization have led to a progressive reduction of times and days of rest, with the result that the fundamental dimension of life has been lost. And one of this is having the opportunity to rest, which he believes is important, that you need to have people not only to regenerate themselves physically, but also spiritually. So in some ways, this is one that I think if you get a chance to read, and again, it's available online, you might find it useful to see. All right, so finally, let's tie it into business. I argue that Catholic social teaching should inform any discussion of business at St. Mary's College, either as a subject area or as career goals after graduation. This position is motivated by the words of my current and favorite Pope. In Laudato Si he writes, quote, "Business is a noble vocation directed to producing wealth and improving our world. It can be a fruitful source of prosperity for the areas in which it operates, especially if it sees the creation of jobs as an essential part of its service to the common good." He's even clearer about the purpose of business in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium. He says, quote, "Business is a vocation and a noble vocation, provided that those engaged in it see themselves as challenged by a greater meaning in life. This will enable them truly to serve the common good by striving to increase the goods of the world and to make them accessible to all." So in my final remarks, I want to give you some words from a homily by Pope Francis that he gave at the Feast of the Epiphany, at the beginning of the year. I thought this was a beautiful set of comments for him. And he goes as follows, quote, "We may ask ourselves what star we have chosen to follow in our lives. Some stars may be bright, but they do not point the way. So it is with success, money, career, honors, and pleasure when these become our life. They are meteors. They blaze momentarily, then they burn out quickly and their brilliance fades. They are shooting stars that mislead rather than lead. The Lord's star, however, may not always overwhelm by its brightness, but it's always there, ever kindly. It takes you by the hand in life and accompanies you. But it also tells us to set out. His star demands a decision to take up the journey and to advance tirelessly on our way. It demands that we free ourselves from useless burdens and unnecessary extras that only provide a hindrance and accept unforeseen obstacles along the map of life." Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, for our first panel, I would like to introduce Dr. Lauren Spieth. Dr. Spieth is another alum of St. Mary's College. She earned her MBA from us, and she holds a doctorate of management from Golden Gate University and a doctorate of ministry from Baca Graduate University. In addition to extensive roles consulting, speaking, teaching, and writing, she's the founder of Elfenworks Foundation and of Elfenworks Production LLC, a multimedia production company. She's a Regent Emeritus of St. Mary's, and she's been central to the founding of our Elfenworks Center for Responsible Business, which is hosting this conference today. So we cannot thank her enough for her generosity of her talent and her time. Please welcome Dr. Spieth.
Oh, good, the technology is cooperating. It's wonderful following the both of you. I don't have to set anything up. It's all, you all know all of it, so I can just enjoy myself. And it's a real joy because so rarely do my two worlds, theology and business, meet like this. So thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, proud of what the center bearing our name is accomplishing, and thrilled at this topic, how responsible business intersects with the world's deepest needs from a theological frame. This is just wonderful. Where I work, we have a mindset called the 7 pillars of social entrepreneurs. You may know them. Follow your vision using your special skills in a non-duplicative way, working in partnership, sharing the credit, measuring for feedback, and staying the course. But they could also be viewed as the 7 pillars of responsible business. Today's subject is so very timely, urgent even. 70 years ago, in 1948, the United Nations gave us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a North Star to guide nations. And 10 years ago, they took it further, affirming the great power that resides in multinational corporations, which are complex beasts, easy to vilify, but they can do great good. As when Pfizer donates millions of doses of Zithromax to the Carter Center to combat neglected disease, or Comcast purposefully hires veterans, or UPS hires part-time college students and reimburses their tuition through their Earn and Learn program. Targeted hiring programs also help the bottom line with a more stable community, positive brand awareness, and worker loyalty. Companies can do great good when they pay a living wage and ensure their supply chain is fair trade compliant and their buildings are green. Our headquarters is LEED certified at the silver level, which is no small accomplishment. And it feels good, though. If the building you work in has a low carbon footprint and is gentle on the environment, that's being socially responsible and a good steward of the planet, and you feel good walking into the door each day. A nod to sustainability helps attract younger members of the workforce, lends your organization and our world staying power, and sets a tone that helps your team approach projects in a sustainable way. I've been involved in many green construction projects, and to encourage others, I created a documentary film, What Green Can Be. But it was my appreciation for green business has reached a really deeper level after watching another documentary, Al Gore's An Inconvenient Sequel, and it moved me to sign up for his climate reality leadership training in Pittsburgh last year. On some level, since we all know something's happening, there's no such thing as climate denial anymore. There's only rejection, and rejection comes from fear, which comes from a feeling of helplessness. But responsible business is a very key to turning the tide on the climate crisis. Make no mistake, climate change is a health emergency. And as our world warms and rain patterns change, many people, often the world's poorest, will become climate refugees. Climate events will strike more often, droughts will worsen, and as soils dry and the price of food increases, more hunger and unrest will ensue. If our house is burning, let's not worry why. Let's focus instead on what responsible business can do in response, why it makes sense for the business bottom line, and why it can be a joy to jump in, doing well while doing good and feeling good. It's a no-brainer for savvy and responsive business. You might say even your duty as citizens of the earth, to outcompete the old established businesses, the ones with the heavy carbon footprint that are heavily vested in the status quo, and put them out of business before they put all of us out of business. One question for today that I was asked to contemplate is why it's worth it, despite the difficulties, to place human rights within a business's working frame. As I've outlined, it's worth it because it's the only sustainable way forward. But the question assumes that doing so creates an extra burden. But what if it creates extra opportunities? We think it does. I actually think our green building has helped us think about our films differently at Elfenworks Productions. For example, our latest film, Exploring Hope, we donated about 2,018 trees to the Nature Conservancy's Plant a Billion project. It didn't break the bank, it underscored the whole point of the film, and it felt awesome. All of this pays off in team cohesion and loyalty. For example, have you ever heard of people staying on 10 years at a small company? They do with us. And with that retained institutional knowledge comes an edge, a competitive advantage. There may be more money in selling guns or cigarettes, but I doubt that we could be very successful at it because our hearts wouldn't be into it. And you don't succeed very well that way, in my experience. We say Elfenworks Productions is beyond film and music, and the beyond is sustenance, something that helps keep people going. Our products uplift and inspire, and if people buy something or tune in, they know what they'll get. It'll nourish them. Likewise, at the Elfenworks Foundation, a 501c3 operating foundation, we stay in our sweet spot, the intersection of our passion, our skills, and the world's deep needs, where our joy and our best success lies. Food waste is another consideration that's linked to the climate and offers business opportunities. National Geographic says that the energy alone that goes into food waste generates over 3.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. That is, if food waste were a country, it would be the world's third largest greenhouse gas pig. That's pretty big. And just consider all that water lost in irrigation to food that then is wasted. Faith leaders, I'd love to talk to you later after this forum about Ample Harvest's Food Waste Weekend, where this concept is spoken about in the pulpit. The most basic human right is not to hunger, yet 800 million hunger, not to starve to death, yet 21,000 die daily, 1 in every 4 seconds.
And when people are hungry, world unrest rises. Analysts trace the Arab uprising, in part, to a spike in the cost of food. Find the profit in food husbandry, and you have yourself a multiple, bottom-line, responsible business. That's the voice of the prophet calling in the wilderness. It's a call to turn in a new direction, to change our ways. The time is now. There's no time to waste. Here's where St. Mary's, again, is well positioned. We've got to have a Silicon Valley mindset, meaning we're willing to take risks. That's the Elfenworks Foundation way. When we feel there's great potential to make a real difference towards a goal of a just peace and a sustainable future, we'll call this radical hope in action, and we will take a risk. Theologically, hope is a key, as St. Paul teaches us how faith is the substance of things hoped for. So our tagline, in harmony with hope, makes sense. His business was tent making, a trade that provided for a basic human need, for shelter, a responsible business. I'm so grateful for the responsible business acumen I gained while studying here at St. Mary's College. For my MBA, I use it every day. But did you know that my family was not so thrilled? When I enrolled here, I think it was about 1985, my father, who had been so proud of me for becoming a software engineer, said to me, "Lauren, how could you study something so banal? Why not chemistry? Don't you have any goals? Don't you want to win the Nobel Prize?" He seriously said that. Now, I don't have to tell you people in the room how important business acumen is if you want to be effective in enacting lasting, measurable, positive change. Business and law are the keys to the kingdom. We pray, "Thy kingdom come, on earth as in heaven." If we want to change this world, we need the keys, don't we? So it's up to us to stand up to the people on the left and on the right who would tell us that business has nothing to offer in the fight for human rights because they're wrong. We need to prove it with our actions. It's easy to think rigidly of business on one hand and ventures that seek to uplift with human rights on the other, as if the two must never meet. My dad did. The fact that he was wrong didn't make him a bad person. He had a good heart. He took us to India to start a school for Dalits, formerly called Untouchables, which is probably where my passion for poverty issues was ignited when I was a child. But this black and white view on business is just not true to my experience. And I imagine it's not true to yours, or you wouldn't be here today. We're of like minds. And because of this, we know there's only so much to be accomplished by wagging one's finger at others from the outside. It's crucial to be empowered with business savvy and to work for good from within. At our best, we can be the yeast who brings the bread to rise to feed the world. I really believe that. And so, for 10 years at another college down the road from here, where I was a guest lecturer in a class that we started on leadership, ethics, and entrepreneurship in their graduate school of business, I told students so. I told them not to believe the naysayers, nor should you. Our commitment to the power of responsible business was made tangible by the naming of this center where we are meeting, which brings me to the most exciting project on the Elfenworks Foundation horizon, and you're the first to hear of it. Do you want to hear of it? It's situated in Jordan, one of the 3 driest countries in the world. When I was in Jordan 2 years ago, speaking at the World Affairs Council in the University of Jordan, I learned of a dream one nonprofit had for a profitable business to address a host of problems at once, including food waste. The Blessed One Society already had land and some of the funding, and were looking for partners. This project, a sustainable hydroponic farm, would save 97% of the water normally required for barley production. Barley would be used as fodder for sheep, so no worries about the vagaries of barley pricing. Historically, Jordanians couldn't grow their fodder because the land was so arid, so they would import it. By eliminating the import of fodder, the project aims to lower the region's carbon footprint. Growing local makes sense, and it's much less wasteful. The farm is projected to be self-sustaining, which is really the whole point. And products from the sheep will provide income. It's going to make a big wave, this whole product. It will provide income, and so the farm can grow. There's more acreage available, and in addition, the farm will provide an educational opportunity for students at the University of Jordan and maybe the high school level also, as well as providing hope to some of the Syrian refugees in the nearby camps who also have farming expertise already. So where does the project stand right now? You curious? Oh, please tell me yes. So right now, on-the-job training of the staff by 2 qualified engineers is proceeding well. An initial list of contacts, customers, and friends of the project has been prepared, and they're waiting for the winter to end so they can break ground for construction. So the Jordan project is thrilling to us because, but listen, you don't have to go halfway around the world to see responsible green food-related business. Just a stone's throw away from here, Copia is a responsible business feeding the hungry, including Californians who were hit by the fire, by helping organizations to donate their excess and get a write-off. Organizations including the Oscars. So the food of the rich and famous has fed over 1,100 people, including newly arrived Syrian and Iranian refugees. So again, we're all connected. So today, as you can see, I'm bringing you a new message of hope by shining a light on business ventures that have at least a triple bottom line. Creating good products while creating a social good and while also turning a profit. They also make work a joy. The United Nations Declaration set forth human rights that include life, liberty, fair work, and so much more, while the 2011 standards outlined how business is responsible as well. Have the standards helped? I say they have because they've set out a clarion call. Corporations have something else they can point to besides the doctrine of the quarterly short-term return. We create goods and services, and when these goods and services are social goods, they help us all. You can change the future, and you can do well while doing good. St. Mary's College is leading the way, and so are all of you attending today. This warms my heart and fills me with joy. I thank all of you for your leadership. Never underestimate your ripple. It is truly huge. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. We'd like to invite you to come forward to the microphone if you have any questions or comments you'd like to ask any of our panelists. And I can start it off if nobody wants to right now. So please queue up, though, as I'm talking, if you come up with a question that you have. I'd like to ask all our panelists this question. In listening to your talks, which I thank you all for, I like this idea as human rights as being opportunities for both joy and profit. I like this idea of rights as being necessary for human fulfillment in very profound ways. And I like this idea that rights are not necessarily constraints on what businesses can do. But I have a question about what the good society will look like when we exercise our rights. And I think of something that Ted hinted at, and that was the idea that automation and technology can put a lot of people out of work, and this is a big issue for a lot of economists and social theorists talking nowadays. And so I imagine that I come up with a really great technology because this is part of who I understand myself to be, to use my mind to create something new in the world, to create some technologies that can, save people from backbreaking work and so forth. And I have a very sort of scientific mind, which if you know me, I don't, but just we're saying for sake of imagination. And I developed this technology, and it makes work obsolete now for 1,000 people in a particular firm or a particular industry. It seems like I would have a right to try to make money from this creation and a right to develop my mind and my skills and my talents. And that's really central for me to be a fulfilled human being. But at the same time, it has a cost on other people. And it may even reduce carbon emissions, right? There's other costs. So what becomes our responsibility to others in light of the exercise of some of our rights, which have these sorts of consequences? Anyone?
Okay. Well, I was thinking in the model that you were raising of like thinking of the cost of those jobs as like an externality in law. And so the question would be, is there a way to internalize the externalities?
Mm-hmm.
And it would seem to me, not legally, because you asked morally, not just, but morally, I think you could borrow from that model and say, well, part of the profits that I have made for my business, there's a cost to others of having lost their jobs. So is there a way that I can use those profits to do, say, for example, job training for those people, to provide education for those people, to give possible loans for those people if they need to move to other places? In other words, understand that the profits, part of the cost, if you will, of the profits were those people who were displaced. Just like in anything where the government would force you if you were producing smoke or smog or something like that as the cost of your business, they might tax you as a way of trying to internalize that externality. Of course, again, you would do that on your own morally, but it seems to me that's plausible.
I don't think the answer is very simple, Greg. We start with the idea that is the job that's being eliminated a job that is fulfilling to the occupant of that job? Or is it a job that the person has taken because of constrained choice? And this goes back to looking at whether or not the individual has had the opportunity to get sufficient education, to have sufficient health, a lot of the other things that are covered in the fundamental rights. And so the sort of what I call the micro case becomes complicated in trying to explicate. And as you were talking, I was thinking about autonomous vehicles. How many people who have taken on the occupation of taxi driver really want that as their vocation? And so this goes back to a more fundamental set of life choices that, we don't know exactly at what point what the interruption is going to come. Then the question turns around to you, the inventor, and I think Bryan is very useful in putting it this way. What's a fair profit to you? Is it all you can get, or enough so that you can make the product work so that there's an increasing amount of leisure that can be gained by a population, and that you would help make that leisure productive?
So my answer would be that there's no way to compare 0 with 1. So you can't compare having no job with any sort of job. When you're looking for work, if you go back to the 30s, you go back to the Great Depression, people were out of work and unable to find any work at all. The dignity of any sort of employment is huge. And this is a place where maybe it exceeds the ability of even responsible business, and then government comes in, as it did during the Great Depression with a public works program. I look at our roads and our infrastructures all over our country, and I think, goodness, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had another great public work program? Because there's some things that responsible business itself can't handle. But the dignity of a job, any job, even a taxi job, can be just exactly what somebody needs. And so I think it can be really complicated.
Thank you. Anyone on the floor?
Hello, thank you for your comments. Can you hear me okay? My name is Brian Ross, and I'm with an Oakland-based NGO called Asylum Access. And we work around the world to make human rights a reality for refugees. So Dr. Spaeth, I appreciate your comments about projects that are benefiting Syrian refugees overseas, but also here. My question to all of you is basically to reflect with us today on your thoughts about entry points for businesses to help with the displacement crisis, to help with refugees, whether here in the States or overseas, especially building on your comments about the fulfillment of the person and the human potential and human dignity, which we have a situation now where many nations are trying to minimize their obligations to newcomers, to new arrivals, to migrants and refugees. Does that create a space where business can step in and help to reaffirm the dignity and the rights of such displaced peoples? So I just wanted to put the theme of refugees out to you and hear your views on where business can start bringing about solutions. Thanks.
Okay, I suppose I should start?
Sure, please.
Well, we love our Jordan project because it could be replicable. So anything that can be replicable is but that's obviously over there. If you're talking about refugees everywhere, generally when people are given any opportunity, when they're really down and out, they'll work really hard. So I would think that microfinance could be really fantastic right now. So I look at something like Microvest, who allows the investment of capital to flow a little more freely, and just think about whether there are any sort of small micro financial opportunities and go in to the refugee camps or wherever and find out what sort of talents and skills are available there and start getting people, getting their own entrepreneurial spirit to work. So a little bit of capital, just a little bit of help can go a long way. But considering the refugees as your partners and just freeing up their own entrepreneurial spirit might be possible. It's the only thought that I can think of at the moment. It's tough. And unless we address the climate crisis, we're going to have more climate refugees. And so all responsible business needs to sort of go upstream and see why more people are falling into the river and stop it.
Well, I'm not sure how I can't address the business aspects as well as Lauren did, but what I can build off of, I think, was what Ted talked about with regard to love, because, and even though that sounds very amorphous, it's actually one of the things that's very sad when you saw so many of the refugee crises around the world and the countries who didn't want to take these people in, and the sense of seeing them as other, and from a different country, a different religion, whatever the excuses were. And what I find troublesome about that is, so you say charity, as Ted said, comes from love. Actually, it does. The Greek word for that is agape. Caritas is the Latin translation of the Greek word agape. And agape is interesting. The Greeks have 4 words for love. Love of your children, love of a passionate love for somebody who's like your best friend or really close, and then has agape. And agape is this kind of universal love for maybe even people you don't know. And it was radicalized, if you will, in Christianity, but not only in Christianity. I think you could see it in Stoic thought about 2,000 years ago. But what's interesting about this notion is that you love people you don't even know. And Pope Benedict has his first encyclical is called Deus est Caritas, or Deus Caritas est, God is love, and uses the word caritas, which of course is the root for charity, and says in there explicitly that when you give to people, when you help refugees, when you open up your doors to people, it's not just an act of this kind of, oh, I'm supposed to give to others, but you're actually supposed to see them as somehow connected to you as children of God. And he actually says in there to see them the way God would see them. And he says specifically, it's not even just the money you give them, it's the look on your face. Do you see them as people? Do you see them as, is there a dignity to them that you actually capture? And what I found disturbing with so many of the Syrian refugees was the desire to categorize them, to see them as other, to see them as not similar to the other people who've come to this country. My relatives from Ireland, people fleeing a potato famine where you're just starving to death. And that's so typical in so many people in this country who came here for various reasons like this. So it seems to me that part of the refugee problem has to first see them, actually has to first recognize them as persons and not very different, if different at all, from you, and certainly extend to them a notion that you're supposed to help them even though you don't know them.
I've been trying to think of it in a sort of practical way. In your proposal, what should businesses be willing to offer in the wage contract to the refugee? How do you determine just the basic terms of trade, service given, compensation in return? In one way, there's a process. It's not just a job. You need to be able, I think, to think of how do you orient the person who is a refugee because they're here to escape something else. Probably, if they had an opportunity to return, they would return. But how do you prepare them for this change is part of the process. It's not just work. It's how do you help them adapt to it. I'm thinking about it partly because as I've gotten older, trying to understand why my family is here. And in doing some digging back on my grandfather, I finally have come to grips that he came to the U.S. for reasons that I originally thought were the reasons, but they were not correct because the timeline doesn't work. So he came here to leave an environment that was not, from probably an inheritance standpoint, very productive. He's not the oldest son. And at that time in Japan, if you're not the oldest son, there are no assets that are going to pass through you to the family. So he comes to the U.S., he's already trained as a doctor, but he can't practice here. And his first job here in the U.S. is a houseboy. And he works for a family so that he can get basically enough English so he can go back to medical school to be licensed as a doctor. He ultimately becomes a doctor. But I don't know if the family that took him in as a houseboy paid him houseboy wages, looked at him, as Bryan said, looked at him as just an opportunity to take advantage of, or did they see beyond that, and here is somebody who might become an asset to the country, to the community, and this is the way they were going to help him fulfill his particular life goal. So again, the motivation behind these decisions is really important. So I have a hard time when we relegate and personify business. It's the person, the decision maker that's key. What's your moral center? What drives you in what you do? And until we come to grips with that, we have difficulties. Most of us don't like to think about those tough questions. Look yourself in the mirror as you say, am I moral today? In most cases, we probably answer, I don't know.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your views.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for speaking today and sharing your views with us. Quick question. With the age of technology, as we move and modernize in that area, one of the main themes I seem to hear more often than not is the theme of cybersecurity. And as issues with technology advance, I think immediately to the Equifax breach. Now, when that occurred, the general public, based on talks I had, seemed to think that, oh, the people in charge are definitely going to be punished for this. More or less, that didn't happen to a larger extent. In fact, Equifax actually made money from that fiasco. Where do we draw the line, and who's actually responsible at hand of managing these crises when it comes to technology, whether it's government enacting new policy and sanctions, or is it the responsibility of the company themselves who claim ignorance that these are occurring? And should they, for especially new companies who are moving towards new product launches, should they truly test out those services and products before introducing them to the public, which may or may not impact them in a negative light down the line?
I love that question. I love that question. I love IT security. What we did is we looked at the nonprofit sector, and we thought, how can we lift up the nonprofit sector in terms of IT security? It's interesting because the nonprofit sector as a whole is disincentivized from doing anything as regards IT security, because every dollar that's spent, the reports go, 97% go to charity and only 3% goes to overhead, which means if you spend any money at all upgrading your computer, even if it's cybersecurity, you're penalized, right? You're supposed to spend it all on charity. So you could, you're basically building your house on sand. And so why is it that, and the reason we got into this is that I learned that children in foster care are 7 times more likely to be the victims of identity theft. And I learned this when I was taking a class, a certificate program at Stanford on IT security. So I thought, what can we do? And what we did was we built a web presence where nonprofits could test themselves and create a little report and take it to their board and say, this is why you need to allow us to at least have better passwords and have a segregated computer for our accounting. Because business is not going to do everything. I know I'm here wearing a responsible business hat, but I also do nonprofit. There's a space for nonprofit, and if nonprofit, and so there's a space for responsible business in IT security to help nonprofit do a better job. And so I won't speak to the punishment of business angle. My idea about punishing business is to outcompete them and put them out of business. And laws aren't going to catch up, and bad guys are going to exist, and so it's irrelevant. Let's just do what you can, find out what your lane is, and do what you can, and do the most good. That's the Goodwill slogan, isn't it? Do the most good. The rest of it is just going to make you sad and depressed, and it's horrible. So do what you can. Right? And so that was the part that we could do. The rest of it, God save us. Right?
Real quick. Okay. Well, I'll give you a philosopher's point of view. When I teach business ethics, one of the things I talk about is character, because you don't always know what's going to happen in your life. You don't know what you're going to be faced with, but you can always try to concentrate on who you are and what matters to you. So I go back, as I did with my discussion, to things like the ancient virtues of justice and courage and others, and then add to them other virtues like self-examination. And so why do I do this? Because I tell the students that some people see business ethics as oxymoronic. But I've taught this class like 15 times, and so I kind of enjoy maybe that little challenge. But I tell them, well, what if you're challenged by the Greeks, the same people who came up with the Olympics, to live a life of excellence, a life of wherever it is that you were working towards your best and you're trying to achieve an objectively good goal? Would such a life be a life where you're 80 or 70 and you look back on it and you've left behind many people's lives ruined, and the kind of life that you couldn't uphold to your children as an example of a life well lived? And so it seems to me, if you then try to get them to think about what a life well lived in business would look like, where you're still making profits, you're still helping the shareholders, you're still helping the stakeholders and all of that, what would that life well lived, what habits would you have, and would they include the habits of, for example, paying attention to security, paying attention to the privacy of your clients and others, even if even if maybe that's more a long-term, you'll make a long-term profit as opposed to a short-term profit. And last point, when we talk about excellence, I tell them, I said, look, don't believe me. When you learned to play guitar when you were 16, did you put up a poster on the wall of somebody who's mediocre? No, you put up a poster on the wall or you watched Jimi Hendrix. When you cared about baseball, did you put a poster on the wall of somebody who's mediocre or bad? Well, no, you put a poster on the wall of somebody who's really good. Well, who's your poster for business? Who do you think did it right, all things considered, that you could look at them and admire them and get to know them both in what they did and who they are and the habits they had, and then try to emulate that. And hopefully, long after they've left my class, I tell them that'll be something that they can keep as they move forward in business. So that's a philosopher's answer.
That's great.
I'll just give what might sound like a flip response to your question, but I can't help it. Brian raised the question of wonder, and I think that was an interesting topic to raise. What I found in my experience when I was on the corporate side is there was not enough wonder in the workplace. And where it comes out to, in a couple of cases I saw, we saw a situation where quarter to quarter there was a fluctuation in the sale of a product. And the reason why it fluctuated, we didn't know. But we started to dig down below it. That was one of my jobs, to find out what was causing the quarter-to-quarter differences. And it turned out it was because of the incentives that were put in place for the marketing people that allowed them to get quarterly bonuses on sales that could not be clawed back even though the product was being returned the following quarter. And so they had figured out how to game the system, and everybody was happy because even the head of the unit never looked at the numbers close enough. So my argument all along, and anybody in business should be always conscious of the narrative in the data. The data tells you a lot. And if you don't pay attention to the data, shame on you, because there you learn whether or not you're being scammed by your employees or if you're being driven out of business by your competition. But you should not ignore looking at the numbers.
Okay. Thank you to all our panelists. This wraps up panel 1. In 15 minutes, I think we'll begin panel 2, where we'll get really serious with law and compliance. But in the meantime, thank you, Lauren, Ted, and Brian, and thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions you still want to ask. Some of them might be answered in panel 2. And so continue the dialogue throughout the conference.